Good morning, my Eco 2315 students. Um, I did record part one of chapter 13, which is a chapter on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So there are a few slides we need to start talking about the concept of equilibrium and how we move the economy from short run to long run equilibrium, just in case there's a macroeconomic shock in the economy or any disturbances. So I'm going to share my screen and then we can talk about it from where we stopped last time. So let me share my screen here. So here's a chapter that we talked about. So I'm not going to go repeat myself. We talked about aggregate demand, factors that drive the aggregate demand curve. We talked about the aggregate supply curve. There were two types of aggregate supply, short run and long run aggregate supply curve. We talked about what drives each of those supply curves as well. So we left when we were starting to talk about the concept of equilibrium in a macroeconomy. Okay. So there's going to be two types of equilibrium. The first type of equilibrium here is going to be the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So long run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when the economy is already producing at full employment. And it's going to happen at a point when all the three curves that we talked about intersect at one point. So you can see this diagram here. Your short run aggregate supply curve that we talked about that slope upwards, the aggregate demand curve, and the long run aggregate supply curve all intersect at one point at this point here. So this point is going to determine this is your long run macro economic equilibrium point. So the output that is going to be produced, which is this $20 trillion worth of real GDP, that would be like what we call your potential GDP, your YP, or your full employment GDP, or sometimes we call it a long run output level because we're in long run equilibrium. And then it's going to be your price. This 115 is going to be the general price level at that equilibrium. Okay, but there's another. So that's long. This is where all policymakers, be it the Federal Reserve or Congress, want the economy to be. The economy needs to be in long run stable equilibrium. That's why, because that's a place where unemployment is going to be low and prices are going to be stable. Everything's going to be stable at that equilibrium. But things always don't happen that way or now. That economy is always going to remain in long run equilibrium. Sometimes economy can be below or above equilibrium. So let's talk about short run macroeconomic equilibrium, what it is. So let me create a new slide here and talk about it. So I need to open a new. Okay. Right. There it is. So the other equilibrium that we're going to talk about, if the economy is not in long run equilibrium, then it has to be in short run equilibrium. So short run equilibrium is a scenario where the economy is not producing on its long run aggregate supply curve. So I'm gonna talk about it here. So we're gonna talk about short run macroeconomic equilibrium. So the short run macroeconomic equilibrium is going to be defined as this occurs when the intersection between aggregate demand curve and short run aggregate supply curve happen at a point which is not on the long run aggregate supply curve. then we say the economy is in short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, which is not on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so there are two types. First of all, when we go back here for the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, we say that this is a point where this corresponds to a point where your actual output equals to full employment output or potential output. Then the economy is believed to be at what? Producing at full potential. Okay, but here we're going to have, so there are two types of short-run macroeconomic, we can just call it macro equilibrium. Okay, so the first one is what we're going to be calling short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Short-run macro equilibrium, which results in a recessionary gap. That's one type of short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. The definition of recessional gap is that when your actual output that you're producing, this Y without anything here stands for actual output, is less than full employment output or potential output, which means the output gap would be negative. So you take the actual output minus full potential output, this would be less than 0. Okay, so this gap that exists when you subtract potential output from actual output is what we are calling the what? The recessionary gap. What we're calling the recessionary gap. So recessionary gap. Okay. But the second one is going to be the short run macro equilibrium or macroeconomic equilibrium in full, which results in an inflationary gap. Okay, so this sometimes the economy could be producing beyond its full employment or beyond its full potential when we are again overutilizing our resources. It's possible that you can produce above potential output. So this is a case where the actual output is less than what? So your actual output would be greater than your full potential output. And therefore, the output gap in this case, if you subtract potential output from actual output, this would be greater than 0, this is going to be greater than 0. Okay. So, and this gap here is what we're calling the inflationary gap, because the reason why we call it inflationary gap, when the economy is overcharged, where you're overproducing again, you're overutilizing your resources, overexploiting, it tends to bring inflation. Prices tend to rise. That's why we call it inflationary gap. So we can draw the two short-run macroeconomic equilibrium scenario side by side. If I draw this, draw another one here. So this is the first one where we're saying this is a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium that produces or results into a recessionary gap. It happens at a point, so you level, this is your real GDP on this axis, and this is your price level. This is your GDP deflator. On this axis, same thing here, you level price level. Real GDP, we can just say Y. So the first one, short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, which produces a recessionary gap, occurs at a point where the intersection between your aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curve is going to happen to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So this is this vertical line, you remember, is your long-run aggregate supply. So definitely we're not in long-run equilibrium. So remember, this vertical line determines your potential output, but the intersection between aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve is happening here, meaning that the resulting output that the economy produces, which is the actual output, is below, see, Y is less than YP. So this gap which will exist here, where Y is less than YP, is what we're calling the what? The recessionary gap. Because clearly you can see that Y is less than what? YP. And then on this case, we're going to have the inflationary gap, which is a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium that produces a inflationary gap. It happens when the intersection between the demand, aggregate demand, and short-run aggregate supply curve happens to the right of the what? Long-run aggregate supply curve. Remember, your long-run aggregate supply curve determines your full potential GDP. But you see the intersection between the short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve is happening to the right of that vertical line. This is going to result into this actual output Y, and this is going to be your price. So this gap here, where your actual output exceeds full potential output, is what we're calling inflationary gap. See, so clearly you can see that Y minus YP is going to be greater than 0. Okay? So those are the two. So now what we're going to be talking next, we're going to talk about issues. How do we close these gaps? Because as I said, no economists want you to be in a recession, want us to be in a recession. And no economists also want us to be on inflationary gap because prices will be rising on us. The ideal situation is we want an economy to be at full employment where all these 2-3 curves intersect. So economy can be in long run equilibrium, but then sometimes we are pushed away from that long run equilibrium. So let's talk about things that can push the macroeconomy away from its long run stable equilibrium point, which will result into a recession or inflationary gap. We need to know from that. Then after we know that, we discuss that, then we're going to talk about the philosophical views or two schools of thoughts in macroeconomics that we use to close the recessionary or inflationary gap. Because economists, we don't agree. Macroeconomists, we have different camps. So we're going to have different viewpoints of how we actually close this recessionary gap and inflationary gaps. But before we talk about that, let's talk about macroeconomic what? Macroeconomic shocks, or you can call them disturbances. So a macroeconomic shock is anything or any factor which pushes the economy away from its long run stable equilibrium. So anything that is going to push the economy away from its long run stable equilibrium is going to be called a macroeconomic shock or disturbance. So there are two types of shocks, of macroeconomic shocks. The first shock is what we're going to be calling a demand shock or demand-driven shock. We just call them demand shocks. So anything which shift the aggregate demand curve to the left or right is a demand shock. We call it a demand shock. And we talked in part 1 of this lecture, we talked about factors that shift the AD curve to the right or to the left. You know them already. We talked about fiscal policy. We talked about monetary policy. We talked about consumers confidence, like if consumers and businesses are more optimistic of the economy, they're going to spend more. The aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. But if the consumers are less optimistic or they're pessimistic about the economy, they're worried about the economy, confidence is low, then consumers are going to spend less, then the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. So we talked about all those. So under the demand shock, there are sub branches of it. Okay, so let's talk about the two sub branches of demand shock. Then we can start talking about the philosophical schools of thought. So how we close a recessionary gap. Okay, so let's go back here. I need a free slate here. Okay, so demand-driven shocks or demand-driven disturbance, demand shocks can be divided into two. Demand shocks can be subdivided into what we call negative demand shocks or positive demand shocks. Okay, so anything which shift the aggregate demand curve to the left is interpreted as a negative demand shock. It's a negative demand shock. And from the first part of this lecture, we listed a lot of those factors. They're going to be things like, example include things like what? Low consumer and business confidence. If consumers and businesses are lack confidence or they're less optimistic about the future of the economy, they're going to spend less. Like the recent war that broke out between Israel and Iran is bringing a lot people are worried about because we don't know what might happen. If the war continues to escalate, that can impact the global economy. Okay. And then another example we could talk about decrease in government spending. Decrease in government spending. If government decreases spending, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Or increase in what? Increase in taxes. Yeah, so you can review those factors we talked about already anyway. And then on the other hand, this is going to be any factor which shift the AD curve to the right. Is going to be interpreted as what? As a positive demand shock, which are going to be exactly the opposite of negative demand shock. So if by government decreasing spending, what we call contractionary fiscal policy or raising taxes, shift the AD curve to the left. So we call those negative demand shock. What about the government decide to increase spending instead and decrease taxes? That's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So they're going to be positive demand shock. When consumers have low confidence and business have low confidence, that will shift the AD curve to the left, so it's a negative demand shock. But if consumers have high confidence or they're more optimistic about the future and business alike, they're going to shift the demand curve to the right, so that's going to be positive demand shock. So all you got to do is just revisit the factors that shift the aggregate demand curve left and right, which we already talked about in part one of this chapter. Okay, so what about supply shocks? So talk about supply shocks, which is going to be the second type of disturbance. So sometimes disturbances to a macroeconomy may not come from a demand side of the economy. They could come from the supply side of the economy. Okay, like supply disruptions. Okay, like supply chain issues that we experienced during COVID, where companies were not getting enough raw material goods. That is coming from a supply side of the economy, not the demand side. Okay, so So supply shocks are going to be defined as anything which shift the aggregate supply curve left or right, okay? And just like demand shocks, supply shocks are also subdivided into negative supply shocks, negative supply shocks, and positive supply shocks. Okay, so here are going to be anything which shift the aggregate supply curve. Remember, there are two types of supply curve: long run and short run. But so right now, I'm just generalizing aggregate supply curve because we're gonna talk about which one may shift and which one may not. Aggregate supply curve to the left is going to be interpreted as a negative supply shock, including example includes like higher energy prices. Because when energy prices are going up, energy is a key source of so like oil prices are key sources of energy that we need to producing goods and services. So for example, when oil prices go up, companies find it difficult to produce goods and services, so they're going to cut supply. Supply is going to shift to the left. Things like low productivity. When workers become productivity, workers fall, that can affect the supply negatively, shifting it to the left. Could be things like higher raw material goods, higher prices of raw material, like supply chain issues. All those are going to shift the supply curve to the what? To the left. And then positive supply shocks are going to be anything which shift the aggregate supply to the right. So they are exactly the opposite of negative supply shock. So when we say higher energy prices are interpreted as negative supply shock because they shift the supply curve to the left, then lower energy prices are going to be things that will lower the cost of production, will shift the what? The aggregate supply curve to the right. So there would be positive supply shock. When we say low productivity, it's a classic example of what? Negative supply shock. That means higher productivity. When workers become more productive, that's going to be interpreted as a what? A positive supply shock. When we say higher price of raw material goods affect production negatively, what about low input prices? Lower prices of raw material goods are going to be interpreted as what? Positive supply shocks. Okay, so now, remember we talked about that economies, we don't want the economy to be in a recessionary gap. Neither do we want the economy to be in an inflationary gap. So the question is, how do we close these gaps? Okay, that's why I want you to pay attention. So the first thing that we're going to talk about first, we're going to start with a static model. Then I'm going to show you a little bit of what they call a real business cycle model or a dynamic model. A static model is going to be a model where this is where we hold the long run aggregate supply curve constant. So the long run aggregate supply curve in a static model does not shift. We're going to assume that there's constants in technology. The overall economy-wide capital stock is not changing that much. So anytime, because those are the things that shift the long run aggregate supply curve. We talked about it in part one. So if we hold the long run aggregate supply curve, that means we're going to be concentrating, shifting aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply curve. But the long run aggregate supply curve will stay the same under the static model. So let's start with the static model first. And then there are two philosophical views, two schools of thought of how we close these gaps. When I say these gaps, I mean inflationary gap and recessionary gaps. So the first school of thought, which dominated the macroeconomic theory up till about a little bit over like around the Great Depression is the classical theory. So we're going to talk about the classical macroeconomic theory, macroeconomic school of thought, which is also called self-correcting approach or self-regulating approach. Okay, so what do these economists believe in? These economists believe that the economy will always self-correct itself and therefore we need no government intervention, no governmental intervention. Government interventions. It's more like a laissez-faire type of mentality. Laissez-faire basically means government hands-off approach to the economic, to the economy. Government should not interfere with the economic fundamentals. How does a government interfere with the economy again? Government can interfere or influence economic activity either using fiscal policy. We talked about that already. Congress can cut taxes or raise taxes. They could increase spending, government spending, or decrease government spending. That's one way government meddles with economy, fiscal policy. If it's not Congress doing that, then it could be the monetary authority, which is a central bank. So the Federal Reserve could lower interest rate by decreasing the supply of dollars in the economy. Sorry, by increasing the supply of dollars in the economy. Or they could increase interest rate by decreasing the supply of dollars in the economy. But these economists are saying that no, we don't want the Federal Reserve to interfere with the workings of the economy. The economy is going to self-regulate itself. What do you mean by self-regulate itself? That if the economy hits a recession where things are bad, we should let the economy fall by itself. Once the economy falls to its rock bottom, then things are going to start getting better on their own. We should let the government should not interfere with the workings of the economy. Okay? So we're going to begin by this. Let's talk about how do we close a recessionary gap, which is caused by what? Negative demand shock, okay, using classical theory. So that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so we're going to say, let's talk about, then I'm going to talk about the Keynesian theory, which is the Keynesian school of thought later. Let's say, how we close a recessionary gap using self-correcting approach. Okay. So these economists believe that in a recession, this is how the economy is gonna adjust itself back to full employment. So in a recession, unemployment is high, but we know that is true. Unemployment rises in a recession. So when unemployment is high in a macroeconomy during a recession, what do you think is going to happen to wages? Wages tend to fall in a recession because many people are lining up for jobs. So employers are going to lower wages. They take advantage of that situation by paying people low because there are so many people who need the job. The demand for work is very high, but the supply, people want to supply labor, but the demand for work is very low. So employers are going to what? They're going to cut wages. So when wages fall, then this will lower the cost of production. Production cost, because wages are the major cost to many companies. Because all companies almost hire labor. So labor cost is a big deal when it comes to producing goods and services. So when in a recession, these economists are saying that government should not intervene because unemployment is high, wages are going to fall, and as wages fall, this is going to lead to a lower production cost. And once production cost is lower, then this leads to what? Leads to increase in supply, in aggregate supply. So the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right until we close the recessionary gap. So when you think about what I've been mentioned here, this lengthy statement, I've not mentioned any government intervention like taxes, did I? I've not mentioned that the government is going to cut taxes or the Federal Reserve is going to lower interest rate because this is a self-correcting approach. These economists believe that government should not intervene in the economy. So anytime there's a recession, according to these economists, unemployment is going to go up and wages will fall in a recession because when many people are looking for work, lining for work, employers tend to cut wages. As wages go down, that's going to lower production costs. And when cost of production is going down, that's going to prompt companies to start producing more output. So the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right, and it's going to shift gradually until when we close the recessionary gap. So let me draw the graph here to show you what is going to happen here. So it's actually here. So we say that, so let's say economy was at point A, remember, and then a negative demand shock hits, push the economy away from its long-running macroeconomic equilibrium point A to point B. So if I ask you to document the short-run effects, the short-run effect here is that what? On prices and real GDP, a negative demand shock, like when aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, is going to cause prices are going to fall. See that? Prices fall in the short run, and output falls as well. When I say output, I mean real GDP. See, output is going to fall, first of all, we're going to move from point A to point B. So the price fall from 115 to 113, the price level. Output is going to fall from 20 trillion to 19.8 trillion. So there's going to be a recessionary gap of $200 billion. Now the question is, how do we close that $200 billion recessionary gap? So based on what I described here, according to these economists, in a recession, unemployment is rising and wages are going to fall. As wages fall, this is going to lower the cost of producing goods. This leads to increase in aggregate supply. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right until when we close the recessionary gap. So that's what's going to happen here. See? So from point B, the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right because when the economy is in a recession, production cost is going to be low because wages are falling, unemployment is rising, wages are falling. That's going to prompt companies to organically start increasing output because of lower labor costs. Okay, they would produce more. So when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right to SRAS1, so the new equilibrium is going to be at point C, where the new supply curve intersect the what? Meet with the new demand curve AD2. Now look at point, see what happens. So when I ask you to document the long-run effect here from that negative demand shock, in the long run, we are back to full employment, but price is going to fall even further. So in the long run, price of a negative demand shock, price falls, continue to fall, but there's going to be no change in real GDP. Okay? So I want you to make this point, but when I ask you a question in the test, that what is the short run and long run effect of a negative demand shock? You're going to start from here. When the economy is hit with a negative demand, so you must always begin at a point where all the three curves intersect. That is your starting point. And then you say the economy is hit by negative demand shock, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. When the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, see, the economy is now in short-run equilibrium. So point B means short-run equilibrium that produces a recessionary gap. So we document that short-run effect on price. In the short run, when aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, prices are going to fall from 115 to 113 at point B, and then output will fall from 20 trillion to 19.8 trillion dollars. So that's going to produce a $200 billion recessionary gap. But economies don't remain in recession forever. So these economies, these macroeconomies who are self-correcting approach, are going to say that once we're in a recession, government should not intervene. The economy is going to self-correct itself. And what is the self-correcting mechanism? In a recession, unemployment is rising. When unemployment rises, wages are going to be falling because nobody gets paid a higher wage when the economy is bad. When a lot of people are lining up for work, employers are going to cut nominal wages. So when wages fall, then the cost of producing goods will fall. And that is going to prompt companies to start increasing supply. And that is why the short run, I guess, supply curve is going to shift to right. Remember, I told you this is a static model. We're going to talk about dynamic model later. The static model is we don't change the what? The long run, I guess, supply curve. In a dynamic model, we're going to be shifting everything. Because a dynamic economy means that technology is improving every time. When technology improves, this long run is going to be shifting to the right all the time as well. But here we're holding technology constant, so the long run never shifts. See that? So the only curves that are shifting here are the short run, aggregate supply curve, and aggregate demand, because it's a static model. Very important point. Okay. So GDP has four components. So a decrease at the end of the four could cause a recession, because we talk about that GDP is a sum of consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export. But remember, this right-hand side is what we're calling the aggregate demand. So anything that affects consumer spending, like low consumer confidence, we talked about that, or to affect investment spending, like low business confidence, will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Or if government spend less money, G goes down, aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. Or if export falls, there's something that net export is going to fall, that's going to affect the aggregate demand curve as well. So this, you see this, so these are some of the post-World War II recessions that have happened in the United States. Like we have the 1960 recession here, then the 1970 recession, we have the 1975. So these poor-looking lines, those are the times when America experienced economic recession. Of course, the worst recession happened in 2007, between 2007 and 2009 here. And then this is COVID recession when we were hit by the pandemic. You see, we went to a recession. Okay. And you can see that something is clear there, that in a recession, what happens is, so this is an index of residential construction. Construction is going to fall during recession. Okay. Because the economy is slowing down. Okay, so that is a negative demand shock. What about positive demand shock? So economy can also be hit by positive demand shock. So this is an example. So anything that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right is a positive demand shock. So now you have to be very careful. Sometimes when I'm writing the question on the test, because in the first part of this chapter, we discuss at length factors that shift the aggregate demand curve left or right. So you need to be you need to know those factors. Because sometimes I may just say, suppose consumer confidence and business confidence go up. So that is going to be interpreted as a positive demand shock. Or suppose government increases spending and lower taxes. That shifts the AD to the right. So that's a positive demand shock. So sometimes I might write a question where I'm very specific, direct on a specific factor that shifts the aggregate demand curve. That means your knowledge of those factors that shift the aggregate demand curve is going to be very important. Okay, I may not just bring you in general. When there's a positive demand shock, that's more general. But I could just go to the specific factors that will shift that demand curve. So you need to watch the first segment of this chapter because that's when we discuss at length factors that shift the AD curve left or right. Okay? So suppose the federal government decides to increase spending and lower taxes, or suppose consumer confidence goes up, and business confidence goes up as well, or suppose maybe what else could affect demand? Monetary policy. The Federal Reserve decides to cut interest rate by increasing the money supply, because that's going to stimulate more investment. The investment curve is going to shift. So for the positive demand shock, you must always begin at some point. You just need to close your eyes and draw this diagram, because this is always going to be your starting point. Before the demand, when I say analyze the effect of a positive demand shock, you need to first begin at a point where before demand shock happen. So you know how to level these curves very well, AD, and then draw the what? The long run aggregate supply curve, because economy will always start from a what? Its long run equilibrium value, where we are producing full employment output. In this case, that number specific is $20 trillion. And then I say, now suppose the economy is hit by a positive demand shock. So this is like your point A, which is similar here. Positive demand shock is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, right? So that's going to push the economy away from its long run equilibrium to point B. So at point B, so I can ask you to document what's the short run effect of that positive demand shock. You document the short run effect on prices immediately. The short run effect is that price increases. You see that on the graph at point B. When we move from point A to point B, the price is going to go up. And then output or real GDP increases as well in the short run. Okay. Now, what is going to be the self-correcting mechanism here? Because we're still discussing self-correcting mechanism. When the economy is hit by negative demand shock like this, what do you think is going to happen? Okay. So let's see here. So here's how does the economy adjust itself back to full employment? Full employment means that we're going to go back to the long run aggregate supply curve. Full employment using self-correction or classical model. So we're going to discuss the mechanism or the dynamic mechanism through which the economy is going to adjust itself back to equilibrium. So we're going to say, first of all, the economy is now producing in what we call inflationary gap, because this is your potential output, which corresponds to this long-run supply curve. The actual output that the economy produces when you're faced with a positive demand shock is 20.3. So the economy is producing about 300 billion more than what we should be producing. So we are overexploiting our resources in that case. So there's a $300 billion what? Inflationary gap. This gap between 20 and 20.3 is what we call inflationary gap. We're going to say in inflationary gap, how do we close that gap? So here's the process. In inflationary gap, because ask yourself, economy needs to be overheated to be producing this much output, which is beyond our full employment. It means the demand for labor is very what? Is very high, and it means there's low unemployment. There's so many Americans who are working. That's why we are overproducing. So unemployment is low in inflationary gap. So in inflationary gap, unemployment is low. And wages are rising. So when wages are rising, so this leads to higher production costs. It's going to lead to higher production costs, shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left until the inflationary gap is closed. Until the inflationary gap is closed. Okay? So once we close the inflationary gap, that means the economy is going to be back to its long-run equilibrium value. So look at what's going to happen here. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So the economy was shifted to point B, but then according to self-correction, because at point B, unemployment is low, we are overproducing, unemployment is low, wages are rising, that's going to beat up the cost of production. The cost of production increases, that means companies are going to be producing less. So we shift we're going to be continue to shift the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, like that. The short run aggregate supply curve too. So the economy is going to end up at this point where all the three curves are getting intersect. So at that point, you can see that price is going to even rise further. So point C is another long run equilibrium. So it's like we move in cycles. So the economy started. So when I ask you to document, I ask you what is the short run and long run effect on price and what? And real GDP of a positive demand shock. In the short run effects when you immediately shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, you're at point B, you document the short run effect, which we talked about here. Price is going to increase from 115 to 118, and output is going to increase from 20 to 20.3. That's a short run effect. But the long run effect is that the economy is going to correct itself. The economy is going to go back when the thing shifts to the left to point C. So the long run effect of that positive demand shock, you can document it, is that price is going to rise further. Price increases. See, it increases from 118 to 121. Okay, price increases, but there's no change in output, in real GDP. So the long run effect when a positive demand shock is that there's no change in real GDP. Why? Because we started from point A, and then the shock hits us, and so we only have a short run effect on output. But in the long run, the economy is back to full employment at point C. Point C, you're back on this what? On this yellow line, which defines your potential output. So there's no change in GDP in the long run. That's what you're seeing here. That's what I drew. So the economy kind of moved from point A to point B to back to point C. Okay. Okay. So that's kind of very interesting there. What about supply shocks? So the good news there is that anytime a demand curve shifts to the left, we talked about this, it causes a recession, like this case here. Anytime you shift the demand curve, and let's say consumer stop spending money, when you study the history of US recessions, it's either caused by consumers becoming nervous and stop spending money, or businesses becoming nervous, or government cutting spending or raising taxes, or it could be due to other factors like the Federal Reserve increasing interest rate or lowering the money supply. Could be anything that affect the aggregate demands, whatever, would cause a recession. The good news is that when a recession is caused by the aggregate demand curve shifting to the left, you only have one problem. Because there are two main problems that economists hate the most, or policymakers hate. We hate unemployment. We don't want Americans to be without jobs, and we hate inflation. Those are the two main I call them macroeconomic evils. But the good news with a negative demand shock is that when the economy is hit with a negative demand shock, output is falling, you have this evil. But price is actually falling. So the inflation is not a problem because price actually falling from 115 to 113. So you don't have any inflationary problem here. And by the way, about 95 to 98% of all post-World War II recessions, which have happened in the United States, have been some kind of negatively driven negative demand shocks. They have been driven by demand curve shifting to the left. Okay, But if a recession is caused by negative supply shock, there's a special name for it. We're going to call it stagflation. You're going to end up with two evils. Not only are you going to see high unemployment, but you're also going to see rising prices, inflation. Okay, so let's go talk about it here. So let's talk about, I'm going to talk about supply shock. So this happened a lot, especially during the 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president, because we had the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which Iran is a major player in the oil market. So oil prices were rising on us because of the Iranian Revolution. Now we have another fight that broke out with Israel. Maybe we may have another stagflation like we had during Jimmy Carter era. Okay, so let's talk about supply shock, a negative supply shock. Okay, that's the worst case scenario. You don't want the economy to be hit by negative supply shock. So let's talk about negative supply shock. Okay, negative supply shock is caused by factors such as what? Rising energy prices, like oil prices, like higher cost of capital, supply chain issues, like we saw during COVID. Companies were not getting raw material goods on time, supply chain issues. Okay. It could also be rising labor costs. Okay. Etc. Okay. So I'm going to talk about let's look at the short and long run effect on prices and real GDP of a negative supply shock. And a self-correction. Okay, so let's talk about it. So let's say, suppose the economy was stable. Okay, so you got price level here. You have real GDP on this axis, which is measured by Y. So we're assuming that the economy was stable. This is your long-run aggregate supply curve. This is your aggregate demand curve. Let's say this is AD, and then this is my short-run aggregate supply curve 1. So this is your potential output, which in our case is $20 trillion, right? So this was our long-run price level, which we are saying is equal to 115 in our case. And then the economy is at point A. Then the economy is hit with a negative supply shock. A negative supply shock means the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. Short-run aggregate supply curve 2. That's a negative supply shock, like rising energy prices, supply chain problems, low productivity, rising labor costs, rising capital costs. All those are things, any of those factors will cause a negative supply shock. Now, this is what I was telling you. Now, which position does the aggregate demand curve meets the short-run aggregate supply curve? It meets it here. So the economy has been pushed away from its long-run stable equilibrium where all the three curves were meeting at point A. Now we're at point B. What's the result on that? That is going to result into what we call stagflation. So the price is going to rise to P2, and output is going to fall. And when output falls, remember, you end up with what? High unemployment. So this is what we call stagflation. A negative supply curve, a negative supply shock causes stagflation. Stagflation is when inflation, you can call it rising prices, and falling output. Falling output implies high unemployment exist at the same time due to a negative supply shock. So it's the negative supply shock that causes stagflation. It causes prices to go up and it causes output to fall at the same time. Now the economy is faced with two evils. It's faced with high unemployment problem, evil, and it's also faced with rising prices, which is what we call inflation. So if we let the economy to self-adjust itself in this case, we know that in a recession, when there's high unemployment, so you already know the mechanism, the adjustment procedure here. So how will the economy adjust back to long-run equilibrium? So in a recession, high unemployment is going to force labor workers to be paid lower wages. So wages are going to start falling. As wages fall, the cost of production is going to start going down. And then companies are going to start what? Increasing production. So eventually, the aggregate supply curve is going to shift back. Because when you're producing more, it means the short run, the supply curve shifts back to the right. So we're going to come back to point A. So but let's first document the short run effect is stagflation. Short run effect of a negative supply shock is when we at point B, we know that what? Price rises, which is called inflation. Rising price is what we're calling inflation. And then output falls. Output or real GDP falls. That's going to result into higher what? Unemployment. So that is a short run effect, but long run effect of a negative supply shock. See, once you're at point B, there's high unemployment because of falling output. Wages are going to start falling because of what? High unemployment. As wages fall, the cost of producing goods are going to start become cheaper. And then companies are going to start increasing production. So the short run supply curve is going to shift back to where it was. So we're going to come back to point A. So that means in the long run effect of a negative supply shock is that there's no change in price and no change in output. No change in Y. Because we end up coming back to where we started at point A. Remember, we started at point A. Before the supply shock hit the economy, we were at point A. That's why we're saying that we're going to be back at that point. So there's going to be no change in price and no change in output. So I drew that here with better diagram. So a negative supply shock. So the economy started at point what? No, okay. Now this is different. Okay, we'll talk about it. Talk about it a little bit later. We'll talk about it later. Okay, so now I want to talk about, so even though self-correcting approach, we have not talked about government intervening here because we started with a demand shocks. Economy self-regulate itself. But the question is, if the economy is hit with a negative demand shock, like we say here, and we're in a recession, how long is it gonna take the economy to self-regulate itself? When we know a recession is painful. Let's say unemployment rises to 15%. You don't want your people to be unemployed for a long time because it's painful. People don't have jobs. Okay? Self-correction might take a long time for the economy to self-adjust itself, like we're saying that for this thing to shift to the right to close the recessionary gap at point C. It might take time. That's why Even the Great Depression lasted for so long, for nearly 43 months, nearly 4 years, because we were under this classical mentality that you allow the economy to self-correct itself. You should not call for government intervention. Then John Maynard Keynes, so let's talk about the Keynesian approach to closing the what? To closing the recessionary gap. What Keynes would do, okay? We're going to talk about this. So the second philosophical school is the Keynesian what? Keynesian economic school of thought, which is named after the British economist, very popular economist. Some of you probably have already heard this guy's name, John Maynard Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes wrote a popular book after the Great Depression. His book was criticizing the traditional classical theory that we just talked about, the self-correcting approach, saying that we should not wait for the economy to self-correct itself because the pain from a recession is too much. It takes so long for the economy to self-correct itself. So we need government to come and intervene temporarily. You know, government can intervene either using congressional tax policy or congressional spending policy. Congress can change tax policy or change spending policy to help the economy recover. Or it could call for monetary policy. The Federal Reserve can lower interest rate to grow the economy out of a recession. So John Maynard Keynes wrote a powerful book in 1936. So it's going to be John Maynard Keynes, 1936. So the title of this book was The Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. This is a book that changed the philosophical view from traditional classical theory. And in many ways, this book was criticizing blaming those the economies that believe in self-correction. They were to blame for what? For the Great Depression. Okay? If government had intervened, Keynes argues that perhaps maybe we would have shortened the duration of the Great Depression. Great Depression would not have lasted so long during the Herbert Hoover era, because it lasted between 1929 to 1933. Okay, so now let's talk about so what does the Keynesian theory say? So they messed up. So let's talk about what the Keynesian theory is all about. And then we can talk about how you can use the Keynesian theory to close a recessionary gap and inflationary gap as well. So Keynes argues that Keynesian theory or school of thought. So Keynes argues that that a recession is primarily caused by low aggregate demand. Okay, right, low aggregate demand. So Keynes argues that in a recession, consumers are not spending money enough, and businesses are not spending money. Maybe they have low confidence in the economy. Okay, so this low aggregate demand, according to Keynes, can be boosted through active government policies. So Keynes is calling for government intervention, such as fiscal policy and monetary policy. And we already talked about fiscal and monetary policy in part one. So what part one of the whatever. Fiscal policy involves what? Tax policy, taxation policy, and government spending policy. This is controlled by Congress. It's the US Congress that what? It's controlled spending, government spending and tax policy. Monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve. It involves money supply, control of money supply, and interest rate. So Keynes is going to argue that when the economy falls in a recession basically means there's low aggregate demand. That aggregate demand can be boosted by, government can boost it by lowering taxes, for example, or increasing spending. Okay, so let's go on talk about how Keynes. So the question is, how do we close a recessionary gap using a what? So Keynesian theory. So how do we deal with a recessionary gap okay, caused by negative demand shocks using Keynesian theory, using Keynesian approach. So you're going to see that this Keynesian approach, you shift the demand curve, you don't shift the supply curve. You using Keynesian approach or Keynesian theory. Okay, so here's going to say we're going to draw. So your winners, see. So let's say this is your price level, and this is your real GDP, as always, on this axis. So you must always start at a point where the economy was in long-run equilibrium, where the long-run aggregate supply curve, the aggregate demand, say 1, and the short-run aggregate supply curve were all intersecting at, say, this point A. This is going to be producing what potential output. In our case, we are using 20 trillion, but you can always use just in general YP, and then you use P here, you can say P1. So we know, okay, so when economy is hit by negative demand shock, we know that that's going to cause a recession. So the demand curve is going to shift to the left fast, AD2. That's a negative demand shock. That's going to push the macroeconomy away from its long-run stable equilibrium point A to this point B. So the economy is in short. So in the short run, we have a recession. So in the short run, as always, you document the short run effect of that negative demand shock. Price falls. You know that, you see it on the graph, and output falls as well because of a recession. So according to Keynes, the reason why we have a recession is because people are not spending enough money. There's low aggregate demand. Okay, because remember, aggregate demand is a sum of consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export. So Keynes is going to say that the reason why the reason why this thing is shifting to the left is because consumer spending is down, business spending is down because of low confidence in the economy. So the government can use what? Either fiscal policy or monetary policy. So Keynes would, in this case, to close the recessionary gap using Keynesian approach, we're going to deploy either expansionary, you use expansionary fiscal policy, which I talked about on part 1 of this chapter. Expansionary fiscal policy means we are going to increase government spending or lower taxes, or some combination of those two. Because fiscal policy deals with taxation and government spending, and that is controlled by the US Congress. So Congress should lower taxes and increase government spending, or those combination of the two. Will be increasing spending and lowering taxes at the same time. Because if the government increases spending, look, G is here, G is government spending. If G goes up, that's gonna kind of help offset the decrease in consumer spending. Or if the government lower taxes, even though you don't see taxes in this equation, when you lower taxes on American families, what are they gonna do? They're gonna use this. That means you put more money in their pockets because they're not paying enough taxes. You ask them not to pay taxes. You give them a tax cut. So Americans are gonna increase their what? Consumer spending. If you give business taxes, like corporate taxes, tax cuts, investment is gonna go up. So that is gonna shift the aggregate demand curve back according to Keynes. That's how you boost aggregate demand curve. You boost aggregate demand curve using fiscal policy by decreasing government spending, decreasing taxes or raising government spending. Then the aggregate demand curve is going to shift back to where it was. So so economy first shifted from point A to point B, then we're going to shift it back to point A. So in point A, we are back in the long run. So at point A, okay, there's no change in what? No change in real GDP and no change in price. That's right, because we went back to point A. But so now there's going to be a philosophy. Okay. Oh, okay. Now that is using fiscal policy. We can also use the Federal Reserve can also deploy expansionary monetary policy. If you're the Federal Reserve and you want to deal with this recessionary gap, you can lower interest rate by increasing the money supply. That's what the Fed does. That's what we talked about here. The Fed can increase the money supply that leads to a lower interest rate. That's what we call expansionary monetary policy by the central bank, by the US Federal Reserve. So either Congress or the Federal Reserve or both of them can act at the same time. They can work collaboratively. Right? They can collaborate and work on policy. Federal Reserve would be using a monetary policy to kind of like boost economic recovery, and Congress would be using fiscal policy. Okay, so either way, so if the Federal Reserve lowers interest rate or raises money supply, lower the interest rate means consumer spending is going to go up because this low interest rate, people are going to borrow more money. Businesses find it attractive when interest rates are low. They're going to borrow more money for investment. But all these are components of aggregate demand curves. So aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. So we talked about that already. That's how we close the recessionary gap. But compare that with what the classical theory say. How did the classical theory close the recessionary gap? It's still here. So the recessionary gap was, we had a negative demand shock. Classicals, you don't talk about government spending. The economy self-regulates itself. So in a recession, we say the adjustment process in the classical theory is that what unemployment is rising, meaning that wages are falling, the cost of production is falling, prompting companies to start producing more because of low production costs. So in the classical theory, we shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right to close the recessionary gap. So we end up at point C. So what is the main philosophical difference? Okay, I think I need to draw them side by side for you to see what I'm talking about. The philosophical difference between using a Keynesian approach or using a classical approach to closing a recessionary gap. So let's talk about the philosophical difference in using classical, using classical versus Keynesian approach to closing a recessionary gap. What difference do you see in the end? Recessionary gap. So if you quickly draw this, let's say this is classical approach, which we already talked about. And then you have Keynesian here. So we're talking about price level here, output price here. So in both cases, we're going to assume that economy was at full employment with long run equilibrium when all these curves intersect. AB1, this is your short run aggregate supply curve 1. So point A. Yes, this is going to be P1. This is YP, full employment. Same thing here. This is your long run supply curve. So we're going to have our short run supply curve here. Then we're going to have our aggregate demand. 1. So this is P1. This is Y1, YP. Then all of a sudden, economy is hit by a negative demand shock, meaning that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. AD2. Okay. Here, same thing, shifts to the left. AD2. So we are here. So in here, the economy, the new equilibrium after the demand curve hits the economy, we're going to be ending at this point. So price is going to fall, just, and output falls because we're in a recession. So let's call this 2, Y2. Same thing here. Price falls, output falls. P2. So what did we say? So using a classical theory, we don't shift the demand curve after the recession becomes imminent because we're at point B. What did we say? This is self-correcting about classical. Let the economy self-correct itself. So in a recession, according to classical theory, unemployment is rising, okay? And wages are falling in the economy. So the falling wages will beat down the production cost. The cost of production is going to fall. So as the cost of production falls, that means businesses find it cheaper to produce more output. So eventually, the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to start shifting to the right, and it's going to continue shifting until when all the three curves again meet at this point, point C. So this is going to be your new supply curve, which is coming as a result of lower production costs. So at point C, when the economy has corrected itself back to long-run equilibrium, prices are even lower, much lower. Prices fall further. Okay, but GDP is back to what? Full employment. Meanwhile, using the Keynesian approach, you are at point A, economy was hit with a recession. What did we say? What does John Maynard Keynes advocate for? He advocates for active government policy, either using fiscal policy. So Congress should either cut taxes or cut taxes or increase spending to close this recessionary gap. Because when Congress cut taxes or increase spending, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift back to where, first shifted this way, but it's going to, the government can shift it back when we increase government. So we're going to go back to point A. Okay. Oh, the Federal Reserve can act by lowering interest rate. Lowering interest rate means that what the Fed would be increasing the money supply. Either way, either using fiscal or monetary policy or a combination of the two will shift this aggregate demand curve to point A. So the main philosophical differences between using a classical theory and using a Keynesian theory to close a recessionary gap is that under the Keynesian theory, prices are going to stay permanently higher. Because when you shift the aggregate demand curve back up, prices are going to remain at P1. Meanwhile, using a classical framework, prices even fall further because you let the so the reason why prices stay permanently high under the Keynesian, that's a cost of intervention. There's no free lunch. If the government intervenes, let's say you are the Federal Reserve, you intervene by printing money. Money causes inflation. That's the reason why prices are going to stay permanently higher. Here, you did not print any money. You let the economy self-regulate itself. That's why consumers are going to be paying a lower price with self-correction. Okay, that sounds like this is the best approach because prices are going to be lower for everybody in the long run. But here's a catch. While prices may remain lower here as economy adjusts to the long run at point C, it may take several years for this economy to self-correct itself. And we don't want economy to stay in a recession for a long period of time. We saw that with the Great Depression. It's not good. Meanwhile, if you use temporary government intervention, what that Keynes is advocating for, you can quickly shorten the duration of a recession. You kill the recession quicker with policy. Here, the recession may take a long time because the economy might be slow at self-correcting itself. We don't want people to be suffering pain of a recession of high unemployment. So those are the philosophical views. There's a philosophical difference in the two. But the key difference is that prices stay permanently high under the Keynesian approach. When you use Keynesian approach, what? To closing a recessionary gap, prices stay permanently lower using the classical approach. Okay. Now, what about inflationary gap? Now, you can do that now. So now Keynes is going to argue that what about if the recession is caused by positive? No, if say let's say what about positive demand shocks, which we already did with classical, but I'm going to talk about the philosophical difference here. Okay, I say what about positive demand shocks? Which cause inflationary gaps. How do we deal with them? Using Keynesian or using classical? So let's again compare that. So let's say this is classical theory or classical school of thought. And then this is Keynesian theory by John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so let's assume that, and you must always start from a point where the economy was at full employment. This is price level. This is real GDP on this axis. Okay, then we're also going to have this in the Keynesian framework here. We're going to have price level, real GDP on this axis. So you must always start at a point where both curve, every curve, all the three curves were intersecting. Short run of the supply curve 1. So this is going to be P1, this is not YP. Then we could think about this is our long run of the supply curve. This is our aggregate demand curve 1. Short run of the supply curve. So you got P1 here, you got YP here. So let's say economy is hit with a positive demand shock. That's what we're analyzing. The positive demand shock means there are going to be things like this. Suppose government increases spending, or suppose consumer confidence is growing rapidly, or business confidence is high, they're more optimistic. People are going to spend more money. Then the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the what? To the right, to AD2. That's a positive demand shock. The thing shifts to the right. So the economy is going to move from point A, from this long run to short run, to point B. So this is what we are calling an inflationary gap. A positive demand shock causes an inflationary gap. So in the short run, price is going to rise as the economy move from long run to the short run. In the short run, price goes up, output goes up. We talked about this. Same thing here. We're all starting at point A. Economy is hit by a positive demand shock. Okay. So we end up at this point, short run equilibrium, where we producing beyond full employment, price rises. Okay. Now the question is, what do you do about it? If you're Keynes, you're going to slow down the economy because there's inflationary gap. Inflationary gap means prices are rising in the economy. Prices are rising on you. So Keynes would advocate for government slowing down demand. How does a government slow demand make the consumer spend less money? All businesses spend less because we are overproducing. That's why we're in an inflationary gap. So to Keynes, how do you slow down the economy? The opposite of what I discussed with the recessionary gap. So you're going to pursue, if you're Congress, you're going to pursue contractionary fiscal policy. You'll raise taxes and cut government spending, decrease government spending. Okay? If you do it, because remember, your aggregate demand is a sum of consumer spending, investment, government, plus net export. You know that. So right now, this aggregate demand curve is so big, it's shifting to right. We need to bring it back. How do you decrease it? You need to lower consumer spending. And how do you lower spending? By raising taxes on households. If you tax them more, they will have limited amount of money remaining in their pockets to spend. That's how you slow down the economy. Or you increase business taxes. Slow down business investment. So either way, that is going to shift the what? The AD curve back. So we will move to point B. You come back here. That's if you're Keynes. So in the long run, prices stay lower. Okay? Or if you're the Federal Reserve, you would be increasing the interest rate by decreasing the money supply. What you call contractionary monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve can either pursue contractionary monetary policy, or Congress can pursue contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy means decreasing government spending and raising taxes. And contractionary monetary policy means decreasing money supply, which leads to higher interest rates. But if you are the what? If you are classical theory and the economy is faced with an inflationary gap, we talked about that already. So when you're inflationary gap, that means you're overproducing. Unemployment is very low, by the way. When unemployment is low, that means wages are rising this time. So when wages rise in inflationary gap, the cost of production goes up. Eventually, it's going to prompt producers to start cutting what? Production because of higher labor costs. So the short run supply curve is going to shift to the left to close that inflationary gap. That's how you close the recessionary gap with what? With self-correction. So prices are going to rise in this case. So once the economy moves back to point C, prices are permanently higher, but we are back to full employment. Okay, so those are the two philosophical views. So the two main philosophical differences is that if you close the recessionary gap using Keynesian theory, price is actually going to be stay lower. I mean, inflationary gap, yes. Prices stay low. Why? Because a Federal Reserve would be raising interest rate. When you raise interest rate, that leads to lower prices because you're decreasing demand. Okay, decreased demand in the economy, prices fall. So prices stay lower. But if you let the economics adjust on its own, that's good. Prices are going to be rise in the long run in the classical theory. So those are the two things that I will talk about. Okay, now I want to talk about something because we talked about stagflation, like supply shocks. So if you're trying to use the Keynesian theory that's why economists, policymakers are always in a being here. If they're trying to use like policy to so when the economy is hit with a negative supply shock, we talked about that causes what? That result in what we call stagflation. Because negative supply shock shift the aggregate supply curve from point A to point B. So in the short run, you get two evils. Not only do you experience inflation because prices are going up, they're rising from 115 to 117, but output is also falling. Falling output means high unemployment. That's what we mean by stagflation. Stagflation is when you have a recession, at the same time you have inflation. Recession means high unemployment. So stagflation means higher unemployment. Again, I talked about it earlier. Due to falling real GDP because of a recession and rising prices, which we call inflation, happening simultaneously. So economy is faced with two evils: rising unemployment and rising inflation. So what do you do as a policymaker? You better choose maybe a less of the two evils. There's no way you're going to use Keynesian policy, like raising government spending. Okay, so now the economy is at point B. Look, guys, if you are the Federal Reserve or you are Congress, who is so worried about the recession, that means you want to put Americans back to work. What would you be doing? How do you create jobs? How do you make companies start hiring again? That means if you're Congress, you would be, because you care a lot more about, you put too much weight on unemployment, you think it's a bad thing. That means you're going to be ignoring inflation. So if you're the Federal Reserve and the economy is at point B, and you think that you want to what? Oh, let's start with Congress. You're Congress, you think that this recession is so bad, we need to move this thing back. Your goal would be, you want to shift the what? You'd be shifting the aggregate demand cap to the right to close the what? The recessionary gap, because you feel like the recession is a problem. But so while you solve the problem, you move to this point here, while you put Americans back to work, we're back to long run, you have made the what? Inflationary problem worse, because prices are going to even rise further on you. So maybe 120, one there. Okay. And if you are what about if you are Congress that hate the inflation? That means you're going to do everything possible to make sure that prices stay where they were at 115. So in this case, you would be doing the opposite. That means you don't care about the recession. You put so much weight on inflation. You think inflation is the worst thing to ever happen. Then you would be decreasing the aggregate demand. If you decrease the aggregate demand cap, see, prices are going to be back here, but you're going to deepen the slump. You're going to make the recessionary problem even worse. See, the slump gets bigger. So solving an inflationary gap with policy is a big headache. Okay. Same, even if we are a Federal Reserve, if like you're hit with a stagflation or negative supply shock, you're at point B. If you're a Federal Reserve that cares a lot more about putting people back to work, you're going to be lowering interest rate, increasing the money supply, lowering interest rate. You'll be shifting the demand cap to the right, just like Congress will lower taxes and raise spending. You end up at this point. So while you put people back to work, you actually made the inflationary problem worse. Or if you're the Federal Reserve who's too much concerned about inflationary pressures due to that negative supply shock, that means you're not worrying too much about unemployment. Then you're gonna be increasing interest rates by decreasing money supply. So you shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, you end the same thing as what Congress has done. You end up at this point, you're gonna deepen the slump while you brought inflation back or prices back to its original level 115, but you made the recessionary problem worse. So a central bank or Congress is going to face a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And that led to some economists, which I'm going to put here, some economists called New Zealand economists in 1958. His name is A.W. Phillips, because it looks like there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So W. Phillips collected the data on the UK economy, and also in the United States economy. So he plotted, so that's what we call the Phillips curve. So developed by A.W. Phillips, who is a New Zealand economist in 1958. So A.W. Phillips collected data on the UK inflation and UK unemployment. And then he put on this axis, he plotted inflation. Then on this axis, he plotted unemployment. He found that there's a trade-off between those two. That anytime inflation is high in the economy, let's call this pi 1. Pi is our notation for inflation. Unemployment could be low. If a government wants to reduce inflation, let's say you want to disinflate, bring this inflation down to pi 2, you end up with high unemployment. That's always true. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But if you're faced with both and you choose one, you're going to make the other one worse. Because, in the graph that I showed you earlier on, when the Federal Reserve decided to reduce inflation, that means they're going to be increasing interest rate by decreasing the money supply. That will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, while they would have brought inflation down, but they would make the unemployment problem worse because they're deepening the slump. They make the recessionary gap even what? Bigger, meaning the unemployment is going to rise much farther, and so on and so forth. And then again, when unemployment becomes a problem, your central bank that wants to decrease unemployment, what would you be doing? You would be printing money, increasing the money supply, because you want to decrease interest rate. You want to solve the unemployment problem. That is going to cause inflation. You're going to go back there. So there's a trade-off between those two. So this curve here, which shows a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, is what we call the Phillips curve. Okay. All right, so no, that's kind of like a side note for you. All right, so I'm done with most of the stuff here already. So all what we have discussed thus far is based on what we're calling a what? A static model. Okay, that's based on a static model. So let's look at a dynamic model. A dynamic model is a model whereby now everything shifts. Okay, everything is shifting. Let's go back. Let's go here. I want to go to a dynamic model. Yeah, because this is just talking about the effect of COVID. COVID-19, there were there were two things going on at the same time. We are having both demand shock and supply shock because we locked down the economy. So aggregate demand, people are not buying stuff. Okay. And then we also had supply chain. But some economists believe that the demand curve shifted to the left disproportionately more than the shift to the left of the supply curve. So there were two things going on during COVID. We got both demand shocks and negative demand shocks and negative supply shocks. See, both supply curves and short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve were both shifting to the left during COVID. Okay, so that led to this COVID recession. See how GDP fell because this point C, let me see, this 81, 82. Yes, point C is a point where the new aggregate demand curve to intersect the new short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So we talked about COVID already, and I'm going to repeat that. So let's talk about a dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply curve. This is a dynamic model. Whatever we have been talking about so far, remember, we have been holding the long-run aggregate supply curve constant. That's a static model. You never shift the long run. With a dynamic model, we assume that over time, technology is improving the economy. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is also going to change. Okay. So our model, aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve so far has been static. That's in the sense that price levels were constant, no inflation. There was no long-run growth. Long-run growth means you'll be shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve, which comes as a result of changes in technologies. Okay, we held that concept, but now with a dynamic model, we're going to allow for continuous growth in the economy. So this is what happened in a dynamic setting. Okay. So let's say let's say there's an increase in aggregate demand. Let me make this bigger so that you see what I'm talking about. With a dynamic model, it becomes a little messy. So there are three curves shifting here. Okay. So let's say this was our full employment. Okay. And then the short run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right. See that from SRAS1 to SRAS2, then the aggregate demand curve is also shifting to the right. And then the long run aggregate supply curve is also shifting to the right, to a new level, because technology is improving. So we could move from point A to point B when all those curves shift in a dynamic setting. Okay. So the same factors that shift the long run aggregate supply curve can shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the right as well. Okay. So that could be like technology, because when there's technology makes you produce more. It can affect both short-run supply and long-run supply curve. Rising productivity. Capital stock, when you build more capital. More skilled workers or more labor. It can affect both the supply, short-run and long-run supply curve. It's in a dynamic setting. Okay. So we could think about using a dynamic model and aggregate supply to understand inflation. Okay, so here's how you all think about this policy. So anytime supply curve, see the short run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right just somewhat, and the long run shifts to the right. When the aggregate, the shifts in, if you let the aggregate demand curve shifts more by a larger proportion than the shift of the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve, the result is inflation. That's right. But if you let those curves shift by the same proportion, let's say demand was shifting by the same proportion as supply, you draw a case during your free time and start from point A when all those three curves were intersecting, and then shift every curve to the right by the same proportion, same magnitude. In that case, you're going to find that inflation is not going to change. The only way you're going to get inflation is when your aggregate demand curve shifts disproportionately more than the shift to the right of the short run aggregate supply count or and long run. Then inflation, you're going to cause inflation. So these are some of the main factors. There was a big recession that happened in America, the global financial crisis of 2007, 2009. These are just the case studies. That started from the housing market. The housing market fell, it collapsed because Americans started defaulting on their housing. So there was limited investment in housing. So that was a big demand shock. It led to the financial crisis. And then in 2008, there was a rapid increase in oil prices, which caused a supply shock too. That made the problem even worse. Okay? So this is exactly what was going on. Okay, so now I talked about the macroeconomic school of thoughts. We talked about the John Maynard Keynes already, who published a book in 1936. I already talked about that. The general theory of employment, interest, and money is what changed the philosophical views from traditional classical theory to the Keynesian theory. Remember, the Keynesian theory advocates for government spending, government intervention in the economy, either through fiscal policy or monetary policy when the economy is in a recession. Classical theory advocates for a self-correcting approach, a laissez-faire type of economy where government should not interfere with the fundamental working of the economy. Okay. So there has been a lot of back and forth in macroeconomics. So when the traditional classical theory dominated up to around the Great Depression, and then when Keynes wrote his book in 1936, this book basically debunked the traditional classical theory. But then, and then again, the traditional classical theory came back strong. They also debunked the Keynes. They came back in the name of neoclassical theory. They also came back and found some weaknesses in the Keynesian theory. And then they debunked some aspects of the Keynesian theory. And then the followers of Keynes came back strong, and they came back in the name of neo-Keynesians. So these are several schools of thought. So when you continue, you can just read the definition of what the neo-Keynesian theory talks about. And then there's another group that started from University of Chicago led by Milton Friedman in 1950s. We call them the monetarist model. They believe that the power, you see, by Milton Friedman, the idea that they think monetary policy or money supply, changes in money supply can cause fluctuations in GDP, okay, and it can destabilize the economy. So I talk about neoclassical theory. You can, and then we have another theory in another new field, which is called the real business cycle theory, which emphasizes the role of technology shocks. That technology is the main driver of fluctuations in GDP, because technology is going to result into both permanent and temporary productivity growth in the economy. Okay, so those economic theories who believe that the major fluctuation in economic activity is driven by technology, changes in technology, they fall in the realm of the real business cycle theories. And then we have the Austrian school, okay, which began in the late 19th century with the writings of Karl Menger, was advanced by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. The Austrian school argues for the superiority of the market system of economic planning. So they're more like them. They tend to be lean towards classical theory because they're talking more about market system. okay, emphasizing efficiency, okay, okay. So, so which school of thought is correct? So today we do not know which school of thought is correct about the economy. Many pieces of evidence can be interpreted in several different ways, depending on what assumptions you put, what values you put, you hold as an economist. Okay, so and then of course you guys, I don't like to talk about Marx, the Marxist theory. Okay, so this was the German philosopher of the 19th century. So Karl Marx believed in what they call the labor theory of value, which attributed all value of a good or service to the labor embodied in producing it. So Marx argued that the market system would eventually be replaced by a communist economy in which the workers would control production. Okay, that's Marxist theory. So because the workers were going to be very, very strong and rise up and overtake the production system, and then that we're going to replace the market system with a communist system. That's Karl Marx, German philosopher at that time. So anyway, this ends my discussion of this chapter 13. So make sure I'm gonna upload this video again. So you make sure you watch part 1, which is chapter 13, part 1, and chapter 13, part 2. Okay. Just you gotta watch them in that sequence. You cannot start watching part 2 because it doesn't make sense. It's because part 2 is a continuation of part 1. Start with part 1, then go to part 2. So there are 2 short chapters that are remaining. I may record one more video for chapter 14 because my goal is I'm going to be in San Francisco in a conference. So when I come back, your exam is going to be on Friday next week. So I'll hope to just cover one chapter, which is the last chapter, chapter 15. So I might record chapter 14 this Sunday, and I'm going to upload the video on that as well. Sunday or Monday, whatever, time I get. Okay, next time. Bye-bye.